This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Amy Fallas. Amy Fallas is a PhD in history at UC Santa Barbara. She holds an MA in history from Yale, and her research examines religious difference, charitable networks, and historical memory in the Middle East. Her work has been supported by the American Research Center in Egypt, the American Society for Church History, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, among others. She is the associate editor of the Arab Studies Journal and serves on the steering committees of the History of Christianity and Middle Eastern Christianity units of the American Academy of Religion. Her scholarship appears in History Compass and Islam and Christian, Muslim Relations, and her essays are published in the Washington Post, Jadaliyya, Mada Masr, The Revealer, Sojourners, and more. On this episode, we mostly discuss her article, Brothers in the Resistance, about research in Lebanon about the connections between Latin America and the Middle East. She is based in Beirut. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Amy Fallas. Dr. Amy Fallas, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you for being here. I'm so delighted that you're here and that we're finally able to connect for an episode on the podcast. Can you just kick this off by introducing yourself a little bit to the audience out there, however you see fit, so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a historian of the modern Middle East, and I'm also a historian of connections between what we would say the Arab Middle East and Latin America. And I just finished my PhD at UC Santa Barbara, focused again on Middle East history. And the dissertation that I was focused on was about religious identities, communities, and its relationship to charity and charitable formations in Egypt during the 19th and 20th century. And so inspired by that, and due to a lot of the research that I had been doing kind of alongside the dissertation, I'm now working on a project that looks at Palestinians who migrated to El Salvador during the 20th century. I'm also looking at what kinds of charitable work they brought along and how it facilitated some unexpected outcomes. And so that's some of the work that I'm doing. And in terms of my interests as well, I'm also a writer. I identify as a writer as much as a scholar. And a lot of these topics that I cover, both in the dissertation and in the future work, is informed by my own experiences as a Latin American woman who has spent most of her adult life in the Middle East. And so, that's just a little bit of background on me.
Wonderful. I'd love to know a little bit about some of the stepping stones that kind of helped you find your niche as a scholar and a writer. Tell me about some of those major turning points along your life that led you to where you are today.
Absolutely. I feel like this is always one of those questions that I have almost a different answer to every time I reflect on it. And it's not that they're all wrong, but because I think you get a sense, especially over the course of a PhD, of how each component kind of influence that trajectory. And so I guess for me, without going all the way back, I guess a lot of what I ended up studying after undergrad was shaped by a study abroad experience that I had to Egypt in 2010. And what that put in place, I haven't really been able to fully appreciate until now, because it was in the fall of 2010. And that was really path-breaking for me on so many levels. Firstly, it was my first time in the Middle East. I was learning Arabic, but it was also my first time outside of a exclusively dominant Christian context. I went to an evangelical Christian undergrad. So this is my first time meeting Muslims. This is my first time even having female professors. And one female professor in particular um, really changed the trajectory of how I saw my interests developing, and that would be or would become specifically Middle East history. And at the time, I was just interested in Arabic and Middle East studies and more contemporary issues. But uh, then the Arab Spring came to Cairo in January 25th, 2011, and that sort of put into motion so many of these questions that I had about religion and religious identity, about resistance, about social movements, and most importantly about history. And a lot of the lessons that I learned in the classroom that previous semester, I could see really unfolding in real time, and seeing such a huge protest movement move across the region while living there just really left an impression on me where that I knew in that moment that I would want to study history and that I would want to study the history of the Middle East and eventually unpack some of these things that we were very clearly seeing was a historical moment. So I would say, in terms of, yeah, this trajectory, academic interest, it was definitely that moment and that period. And I'll just say, just to kind of cap off that trajectory, the professor that I took that undergrad class from ended up becoming my PhD advisor. Who, so I've had like a 15-year journey with her, and
Amazing.
yeah, yeah. So it's like it's a very full circle. Everything about a lot of the research that I've done, and or even where those interests got started.
Wonderful. You sent me some work that you've been working on recently, and about Lebanon and connections between Latin America and the Middle East, titled "Brothers in the Resistance." And I would love to know a little bit about if you can sort of tell me about the origin of this article and tell me a little bit about the central argument that the piece is making.
Yeah, of course. So this article is, I think, my most favorite piece that I've written
Ah,
in a
fabulous.
while. And I'll say that because it was actually commissioned by the editors of NACLA, which is the North American Congress on Latin America. And they reached out to me a while ago. I mean, maybe, I guess at this point, almost 2 years ago, to say, hey, we know that you've written a lot about Palestine and El Salvador, so we would love for you to contribute something to this special issue we're doing on Palestine and Latin America. And so, actually, at that time, I had written a lot about, let's say, the rise of Nayib Bukele, who's the president of El Salvador now, who's of Palestinian origins. I've also written about like the history of Palestinian migration itself to El Salvador. But this was a time for me to maybe brainstorm, I think, a little bit about something else that was within that realm, in that same topic theme. And at that time, I had just recently moved to Lebanon. And as I'm sure, you and many of the listeners are aware, we've been having a lot of turmoil in the region, and particularly from obviously the war on Gaza, but a lot of that also affected Lebanon to the point where Lebanon did become, and is still actually, in this theater of war. And so I was the Salvadoran woman uh, who had been living in Egypt. I moved to Lebanon. I get this request, and I start to look into um, what some connections were, could have been between Latin Americans and the Lebanese in particular during the 70s and 80s, because that was a time in which both countries, El Salvador and Lebanon, were experiencing civil war. And the more that I dug, the more that I realized there was a fascinating story of connections between sort of these resistance movements in these countries, but also regionally, to try to counter the effects of U.S. intervention, U.S. and Israeli interventions into these civil wars. And so the more that I dug, the more that I found this fascinating story through this individual of Shafiq Handal, and how during this kind of peak of uh, not just war, but of feeling like their political projects were failing, that they kind of found hope in collaborative venues together.
Mm. Yeah, the history of Salvadoran and Middle Eastern resistance and solidarity was something that I had no idea about. I've never heard of Shafiq Handal at all. So this is all brand new to me. So tell me a little bit about who Handal is and what inspired you to like research and write about his 1981 visit to Beirut, because this is all brand new to me. So I need like the most basic explanation of this possible.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I am Salvadoran, and I have had family members who known all about this, but I had no idea myself. So yeah, like let's take this journey together a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the great thing about this individual is that I found a lot of archival material on the internet that was like open access. And so I think it really was like I was Google searching, and this individual kept coming up who is very well known in leftist circles in Latin America during the 80s, during the 70s, 80s, 90s. Um, but isn't someone that actually even is as visible anymore. He did pass a while back, um, but actually, he's probably the most prominent leftist communist figure, both in terms of what he was doing diplomatically between leftist factions in El Salvador, but also theoretically, his writings and his work beyond El Salvador. And so I was able to find a lot of documents of his family, who I learned were Christian Orthodox migrants from Bethlehem,
Mm.
who had come to El Salvador. And it's very interesting because I had also done previous work on this group of migrants. And basically, all of the Palestinian migrants that came to El Salvador were almost exclusively Christians from Bethlehem. Um, but they come at this time that there's a lot of xenophobic ideas about people from the Middle East. There are a lot of stereotypes that are circulating, and sort of fear of immigrants just more generally, but of this group in particular. And what's interesting is that these immigrants come and they say, we're Christians from where Jesus is from.
Mm.
You have to trust us, you know? And so they kind of start peddling and bringing over these artifacts and souvenirs from Holy Land, and start to frame themselves in that way to become more racially legible in a Catholic country. And so Andal like emerges from this milieu. Like he's born in the 30s, where like his xenophobia in El Salvador is at an all-time high. His family would have experienced a lot of the repercussions of that racism. And he himself grows up and starts a career in activism as early as the age of 14. So he's leading strikes and, doing a lot of labor mobilization, and eventually becomes really a prominent figure in the Communist Party. And so it is decades and decades and decades of all of this work. And also, I would assume, his reflections on his own ethnic background that makes him the primary point person for these diplomatic relations with people from his heritage, from Lebanon, from Palestine, later during the 70s and 80s.
Wonderful. Well, so his family's from Bethlehem, which is currently in what's known as the West Bank in the Palestinian territories. And I'm wondering if his Palestinian heritage had any role in shaping the perceptions of him during like Salvadorans like civil wars and things like that. Did that have any like impact on how like global powers like the US or Israel saw him during those times?
Thank you for that question, because I think that that's one of the more crucial aspects of not just the article, but really thinking through perceptions of Palestinians, not just now, but that these perceptions have sort of longer historical trajectories. And
Absolutely.
so, yeah. And so in this moment, as you mentioned, um, so he's being perceived, even though he has this Christian background, he's not being perceived for that. And what's very interesting is that the Christianity of Shafiq Handal and of his family kind of becomes erased. Um, and he becomes primarily identified by this Palestinian identity that kind of similar to the US, how Americans are thinking about Palestinians in this period, in the era of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and Yasser Arafat and individuals like this, is that they're kind of these pernicious individuals, that they're dangerous, that they are, they're these high profile, um, events where there's, airplane hijackings, or there's Palestinian resistance in areas that are being occupied in their homeland. And so that becomes the kind of cognate for anyone who identifies as Palestinian. And so that is what becomes one of his identifiers in El Salvador. He actually ends up getting exiled for a while. But then also in the US, they suddenly become tremendously interested in Shafi Andal because he's incredibly mobile. And he's moving around and mobilizing connections and pulling resources. And basically, the CIA and the State Department keep an incredibly close eye on him because he's interacting with these figures that are also deemed as a danger, not only to the Israeli state project, but ultimately to the US itself. The US is seeing them as potential uh, figures that would fund, let's say, you know, anti American sentiment from the diaspora in the US. But then, of course, at the same time, the US, under the religious right, under Ronald Reagan, is also very interested in squashing all leftist movements and resistance in Central America in particular. So he's seen as this very dangerous person to a lot of different places, and his movements are surveilled and monitored very closely.
Gotcha. Before I want to talk more about 1981 in a second, but I want to step back for a second because there's something else that I didn't know anything about, and that is Middle Eastern migration to Latin America, just in the big picture. And, if you think about the history of the region, the creation of refugee camps like, the Gaza Strip or those in Jordan or Lebanon, you can understand that migration happened a lot, especially around like the Nakba, as it's referred to in the world. But what do we need to know about Middle Eastern migration to Latin America? Because that's a variable that I had never really taken into consideration before.
Yeah, I think so. We know so much about, yeah, like many of the events you just mentioned. These kind of major ruptures or catastrophes, such as the case of the Nakba, that propels Palestinians to move, to be expelled from their homelands, and to seek opportunities or chances for survival and existence in other places. And we think immediately of the Middle East, but actually, um, there's a lot of migration to the Western Hemisphere, and this actually begins in the late 19th century. So migration from the Middle East to Latin America was part of a bigger move of Middle Eastern migrants to the Americas more generally. And there are actually a lot of really fascinating stories and a lot of other scholars who are doing really exciting work tracking some of these journeys, because a lot of these migrants just thought America, right? Like there's just this big place and it's
Mhm.
America and it's kind of all America. And actually, Latin Americans would agree. Latin Americans think that like America is just one, it's the hemisphere. There's no like North or South America, it's all America. So these migrants do want to go to the United States, but sometimes they end up sidetracked and they end up in Veracruz, in Mexico, in Brazil. So huge populations of these communities, set up shop there. Some of them end up going back to the Middle East. Some of them don't. But basically, these communities had been in movement in this way for a while. And actually, it's interesting because what the Nakba does in a few years before, when the British have control through the Mandate of Palestine, start to limit which Palestinians can even go back. Uh, that is when a lot of these Palestinians in Latin America try to get their Palestinian citizenship. So they are identifying with and fighting for Palestinian citizenship even before 1948 and definitely after. So there's still this deep connection to their ancestral homeland that persists even amidst all of these events that sees a lot of their family and friends expelled from their historic homeland.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's spring back to Handal in 1981. Why is 1981 such a pivotal moment in the article that you write, Brothers in the Resistance?
Right. So I so I'm a historian of mostly the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'm usually dealing with documents, but I remember I was writing this article um, about Palestinians in, Salvadoran Palestinians in Lebanon. And I find this video in nine of from 1981, and it's Shafiq Handal. And I'm like I'm geeking out because it's just not a source that I'm used to just kind of running into. And it's this press conference that he's delivering to the local media in Beirut. And I think what became really fascinating for me is like when I saw that video, that's when I really started to try to find out as much as I could about his movements in Lebanon. Um, and during that press conference in particular, he's laying out a program of why there needs to be greater interregional collaboration. And he's saying things that were very in line with what these resistance movements were about, but also at the same time, he's he's not he's kind of disavowing or had for a long time any kind of armed resistance. So he's thinking more in terms of strategy, in terms of a PR push. He's talking about people who are going on hunger strike, for instance, in the US, and how he should be, or these coalitions should be supporting these kinds of moves to discourage US financial and material investments from the violence that's plaguing both Lebanon and El Salvador. So he's really thinking big picture. He's thinking about the systemic roots for why these civil wars got so violent because, of course, it was an internal issue, but it became so international because of these huge sources of funding and of weapons that were facilitated through the US and Israel. And so the 1981 moment is really pivotal, but it's also pivotal because both kind of leftist coalitions in Lebanon and El Salvador are hitting a wall, and sort of losing steam for many reasons, and they're different. But I think instead of sort of descending into hopelessness or sort of accepting what some people might consider an inevitable outcome, Shafiq Handal is really mobilizing and inspiring uh, closer collaborations and closer relations.
Excellent. So let's talk about some other people too. Let's tie in some major figures of the time, like Yasser Arafat, Mohsen Ibrahim. How do they fit in?
Yeah, well, I think that Yasser Arafat, for instance, is a kind of polarizing figure for a lot of different people. But he is kind of seen as this one of these like universal resistance figures. Um, that garnered a lot of respect at the time, not just from the region, not just for Palestinians and not just for those on the left across the Middle East, which, I mean, there were many. There were the communist parties in the Middle East had their heyday in the 50s and in the 60s and had huge memberships. And it is within this context that Yasser Arafat also comes sort of into his own kind of political person. But also he's an important figure for resistance movements in other places. And I think it is actually when Shafiq Handal starts to cultivate closer relations with him in particular that, let's say, the US becomes incredibly interested in that, because then the issue becomes, well, they're going to share resources across borders that will endanger sort of the broader right wing, and conservative projects that were ongoing in Israel and the US. So that's where I think figures like Yasser Arafat are so crucial, because they kind of accelerate and underscore sort of this fear that the leftists are getting closer and they're going to be transgressing a lot of these borders, if not intellectually, certainly materially.
Yeah, something that I found myself wondering is if Israel's extensive role in arming forces in Latin America was some kind of overlooked aspect of Cold War history. What are your thoughts on that? Because I was asking myself that while I was reading the piece quite a lot.
Well, it's so fascinating to me because this discourse comes up again every so often of, you know, you let us take care of our side of the region and you worry about your side of the region. Because sometimes you'll have like a lot of critics of Israel, for instance, and there'll be some kind of even just diplomatic support for places like Latin America, Asia. And that overlooks actually how central Israel was to facilitating arms movement, arms trade, and even and physical training, right? So a lot of, let's say, from the counterinsurgency in Latin America, the right wing, the government, military, militias, all of those, the death squads in Latin America. Some of the most prominent death squads in Latin America were trained not just by the US military, but also by Israelis. So, discounting Israel from that equation is missing also that they were deeply, deeply involved in what was going on in the Western Hemisphere. And this, I mean, obviously a key component of the Cold War, but I also think it was one of the strategies that the US gradually relied on so that they would not be seen as being directly or directly interfering into Latin America, because they could do it through this proxy. So there's this perception that the Israelis sort of manipulate the Americans. But then there's also this history of the US needing the Israelis as a proxy in the Western Hemisphere to sort of disavow this perception of their involvement. And I think that is a very crucial component of this story.
I'd love to know about why you think that Handal matters today, 40 plus years later, given the context of what we're seeing with current events in Gaza, also Central America. Why does he matter now, all these years later?
Absolutely. I don't think it's an accident that these regions that I wrote about, whether it's El Salvador or whether it's Lebanon, are frequently in the news today. And of course, it's tied through this thread of Gaza, the war on Gaza, and on Palestinians. And something that I think this story of Shafiq Handal and the work that he did, and these sort of avenues of solidarity, particularly in these moments that felt so hopeless, is precisely the strength in international solidarity and in also facing what are incredibly unequal relations of power. In this moment in 1981, you have Shafiq Handal being very aware that the financial, material, weapons, stockpiles, but also technical expertise was very much in favor of sort of this monolithic relationship, special relationship between Israel and the United States. And that's something that we're facing again. This is something that we see again. And if you look at the extent also of how globalized this has become, to challenge or to even critique or to even say, to call things a humanitarian crisis, much less a genocide, we can see how great that monolithic power has become. But something that I think this precedent gives us is sort of the moral clarity of fighting for people and fighting for what's right, and to do that even when the odds seem so stacked against you. And I think that that is ultimately a hopeful story, and one that keeps us from despair, which is in and of itself, I think, inherently valuable.
Yeah, are there any personal archives or oral histories that you wish more people would check out on this topic?
Hmm. There are so many.
Give us
um,
some suggestions.
yeah, okay. So there's actually a really beautiful website called Planet Bethlehem. And there are a lot of sort of personal papers, photographs, both, I guess, mostly family based, but also organizational and institutional, from Palestinians sort of in this, who have had these experiences, who have been in migration, who have deeply moving stories, and, the archives to sort of demonstrate all of these different trajectories. I also would recommend there are a lot of good podcasts about individual stories. Um, so the Ottoman History podcast has some of these narratives of these migrants, uh, particularly from the Middle East to Latin America, that just make you scratch your head of like, how did they survive all of that? How did they keep moving forward? So those are some of the kind of first instinct sources I would recommend.
Excellent. Where can people find Brothers in the Resistance again if they wanted to go and read the whole article for themselves?
For whoever's interested, the article, Hermanos al-Muqawama, Brothers in the Resistance, you can find it in the NACLA report on the Americas. And it was published in 2024. And the cover says, to exist is to resist, Viva Palestina Libre. So that's the title of the special issue.
Excellent. So let's chat a little bit about your work with sacred rites recently. I know you did the training for the public scholarship cohorts, and I would love to know just a little bit about your experience and takeaways from doing that work recently.
Yeah, so I am a huge fan and have been for a really long time of all of the work that Sacred Rites does. And I would say that I find it's probably more important now than it ever has been to keep having that kind of a program. And I'll just explain what I mean by that. I think in addition to we have this sort of disconnect between like academic audience and the public audience. And so it's kind of hard when you're writing all of these peer-reviewed articles. And obviously that's more geared toward a very specific academic audience versus, your friends or family, or, people looking to read something at the airport, right? Um, but I think it goes beyond that. Now, people's media diet is so different. The way they consume new information um, has become completely transformed, and I think AI is also changing a lot of those dynamics. And and I think what Sacred Rights training does is not just to demystify what some of those avenues of sharing, translating your work is, but also to become literate ourselves in like how these new technologies are shaping how to share with the public, right? And I think some of those avenues could be things like podcasts, but also TikTok videos and there's so many different new things that I think can be very intimidating or
Mhm.
it could be overwhelming, I think is the issue of how do you get from the print and the scholarship to that other output. And Sacred Rights really helps in saying, you know, this is what's out there. These are the tools that you can use. And this is how you can really have a greater impact with a lot of the valuable research and work that you have put in.
Well, Dr. Amy Fias, it has been wonderful having you on the podcast. I have loved learning about the life of Shafiq Handal and some of these, resistance movements that I had no idea about for all of these years of my life. So that is one of my favorite things about this podcast is being exposed to brand new information. 8 years in to doing this show, it never ceases to amaze me that there's always more to learn. But if people want to follow along with what you are doing now and in the future, where would you suggest they go to follow along?
Yeah, and thanks so much, Greg. I really have enjoyed our conversation. In terms of future work, I am surprisingly still on Twitter,
Mm.
now known as X. It's just Amy underscore Hayas. And I also do put up my work at my website, which is just my name, amyfias.com.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Amy Fias, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been so wonderful. Thank you so much.